Hey everyone, by this point you should have played around with HTML and CSS enough to understand how it works. But more importantly, you need to have a good understanding of the following JavaScript concepts: variables, objects, arrays, functions, and two array methods, map and find. With that basis, you're ready to dive in and start building some real apps. Pretty much any app you build is going to need a way to create user accounts so that users can sign in and out of their content. This is called authentication. If you were tasked with building an authentication system by yourself, this alone could be an entire class due to the security issues you have to deal with. Fortunately, Firebase includes an authentication product that takes care of it all for you. It's pretty sweet. So our first app is going to be an authentication app. It will look like this. First, the user will be brought to a screen that prompts them to sign in with their email and password. To the left of the sign in button will be a link to a sign up page in case they don't have an account. Let's take a look at that page. Notice that it looks almost identical with just a few text changes. Flipping back over to the sign in page, I'll type my email and an incorrect password. And press sign in. Notice that an error message pops up. Cool. I'll fix that and click sign in again. This time it took me to a logged in view. The logged in view simply has a hamburger menu icon on the left and a sign out button on the right. Clicking on the hamburger menu opens a drawer that could contain a list of options. And finally, clicking the sign out button takes me back out to the sign in page. Pretty simple, but most apps you build are going to need this sort of framework, so this will be a good place for us to start. Let's dive into the code. In the first video, you should have your authentication app starter all set up. Let's open our code editor, Code Sandbox, and look at our code to understand what all the different files do. You should see 3 folders and then about 10 files. All of these files are configuration files. They configure React, Firebase, and Travis. You won't need to edit any of these files for this class. The Functions folder has 3 files in it. The files relate to Firebase Cloud Functions. Cloud functions are functions that run in the cloud and are typically things that don't happen in real time. For example, you might have a function that watches for new user signups and then, say, 30 minutes later sends them a welcome email. We won't be writing any cloud functions until later in this course, so you don't need to worry about this folder for now. The public folder contains favicon.ico. This is the little icon that appears on the tab bar. Right now, it's the React icon. Though not required for this course, you could delete this file and upload a new icon. The file would just need to have this exact file name, favicon.ico, and be the correct dimensions. If you ever added a website to your home screen on your phone, the name and icon that show up on your screen are controlled by manifest.json, this file here. So you can edit this file to change those things. Again, not a requirement for this class, but definitely good to do if you're building a real app. Finally, index.html. This is where it all starts for your app. As I've mentioned before, we will be building our app using React. With React, you write all of the HTML and CSS inside of JavaScript, so we won't edit this file at all, but let's take a moment to understand it. The first thing you should notice here is that there are no links to our JavaScript files. When we push our code to GitHub, Travis has been set up to run several operations. One of them is to build our production files. Essentially, it will take all of the JavaScript files that we write, mash them together into a single file, compress that down, and then insert a line into this index.html file with a link to that created file. The utility that does that is called Webpack. Webpack is handy for 2 main reasons. First, Webpack allows us to use all the latest JavaScript features. Different browsers support different versions of JavaScript. With Webpack, we can write code using the latest JavaScript features and then leave it to Webpack to translate it into a version of JavaScript that all browsers can understand. Second, Webpack lets browsers know when they need to download a new version of our JavaScript files. JavaScript files are called static files. To make browsing the web faster, browsers save static files to your computer. This is called caching. So when a browser loads an index.html page, it looks at the file names and the links to see if it already has the files in its local cache. If it does, then it doesn't download them again. If we hard-coded a link to our JavaScript file here, browsers would look at the file name and say, I've already got that file. And then they wouldn't download it again, even if we had changed the file's contents. Webpack fixes this problem by generating a unique file name every time it rebuilds our files. The second thing to notice is this div right here. Notice that it has an ID of root. React is going to insert all of the HTML that we write in our JavaScript files into this div. So it's very important that you don't delete it. Finally, the source folder, or SRC folder. This is where you're going to spend the majority of your time. First, let's talk about the files we won't be using in this class. We won't be using the CSS files, the serviceworker.js file, or the app.test.js file. We'll be writing our styles in line, so that's why we won't need the CSS files. The serviceworker.js file never needs to be edited. It's just for making React work when the user is offline. And the app.test.js file is for writing tests for your code. This is actually really important when you're building large-scale apps, but it's beyond the scope of this class. The three files we will be using are index.js, app.js, and firebase.js. The most important of these is index.js. When Webpack builds your JavaScript files, it first starts with index.js and looks for all the files that index.js links to. It will then look in those files for any files that those files link to, and so on. So every file has to in some way link back to index.js, or else it's not going to be included in our project. All right, so let's look at this file carefully. At the top of this and most JavaScript files, you'll see import statements. This is how you include code from other JavaScript files. Let's look at the first import statement. It says to import something called React from a file called React. If the from location is just a name and not preceded by a path, like these ones down here, then Webpack will look for that file in our dependencies. Dependencies are third-party JavaScript packages that you can add to a project. Our dependencies are listed here on the left. Notice that you can click this button to add new dependencies. As you would expect, one of our dependencies is called React. So that is what the from React is referring to. On the next line, we import from React DOM, which you can also see here. The third line imports from ./index.css. ./ is how you indicate that the file exists in the same folder as the current file. So in the same folder as index.js, we should see a file called index.css, which we do. Notice also that line 3 doesn't use import from. It just says import. This means that it is importing the entire file. Line 4 deals with the service worker, which you don't need to worry about, so we'll skip that. Finally, line 5 imports something called app from ./app. Since no file extension is included, like a .html or .js, Webpack will assume that it is a JavaScript file that we're referring to. So it's going to look for a file called app.js in the same folder as index.js. That's right here. In a minute, we'll talk about why those curly braces are there, but for now, let's continue on. Line 7 is where we actually start to run some code. React DOM references the thing we imported here on line 2. It looks like React DOM must be an object since we're using a dot after it. And it looks like inside of that object there must be a function called render. I know it's a function because of these parentheses. So line 7 is running the render function inside of this React DOM object. It looks like this function accepts two parameters. Notice the comma separating the two. The first parameter looks like a kind of HTML thing, and the second parameter looks like a location inside of a document called root. Now, you could read the React documentation to understand exactly what this function does, but let me just explain. This function accepts two parameters. The first parameter is the content that you want to put on the screen, and the second parameter tells you where to put it. Since this index.js file is going to be loaded inside of index.html, index.html is our document. So this statement is saying to put the app content inside of an element with the ID of root. Remember that line from index.html? Flipping back over here to index.html, this is the element with an ID of root. The app content is going to be inserted right here. To make this even more clear, I could change the ID here to be called home, and then flip back over to index.js and change this to be home, and everything will work just the same. Okay, so that is the index.js file. It is a starting point for all of our JavaScript. Now let's talk more about line 5. As already discussed, this line imports something called app from app.js. Let's open app.js and take a look. Notice line 3. We are exporting a function called app. In order to import something from a JavaScript file, it has to first be exported from that file. So when we import app on index.js, we are importing this function that is called app. Now, back to those curly braces on index.js. Compare line 5 to line 1. Notice that line 1 doesn't use curly braces around the item being imported, but line 5 does. There are two different ways of exporting items from a JavaScript file: regular and default. If you use a regular export, then when you import it, you have to use the curly braces, and the name has to be exactly the name of the item you exported. If you use a default export, then you don't use the curly braces, and the name can be whatever you like. I'll write a default export so that you can see what I mean. Back on app.js, I'm going to copy the app function and change it to be a default export. So first, I'll copy and paste it. We want a unique function name, so I'll call this function sign-in. And then to change it to be a default export, all I have to do is write export default, like this. Now, back on index.js, to import the sign-in function, all I have to write is import sign-in from /app. No curly braces, and because it's a default export, I can actually change sign-in to be whatever I want. I'll change it to be foo. Since you don't have to refer to default exports by their actual name, you can only have one default export per JavaScript file. The last thing to note is that I can combine these two lines like this. So that's the index.js file and the app.js file. I'll come back to what those functions do in a minute, but for now, let's take a quick look at firebase.js. You've edited this file already. You pasted in your Firebase project details between these curly braces. Lines 15 through 19 initializes our connection with Firebase and sets us up to do authentication and database functions. This file isn't actually referenced anywhere in our app.js or index.js though, so currently it's not doing anything in our project and won't be included in our build files. We'll come back to this file later, but for now understand that it's where we configure and initialize our Firebase connection. Alright, so that's an overview of our project structure. Next, on to actually building stuff. To build our app, we'll be using a JavaScript framework called React. A JavaScript framework is a set of pre-written code that makes routine programming tasks easier. The big thing that React gives us is an easy way to build components. You can think of a component as a Lego. Once constructed, a Lego can be used over and over again wherever it's appropriate. Similarly, with React, you can create a component like a button or a dialog box once, and then use that component anywhere in your code that you need a button or a dialog box. With enough components, building the user interface of a website with React starts to feel more like putting Legos together than writing code. One of the cool things about components is that you can create components out of other components. For example, you might make a dialog box component that consists of several components, including a button component and a headline component. With React, everything that gets displayed to the user will be a part of a component. With that background, let's hop back into our authentication app. We'll start with line 7 of index.js. Recall that this line tells the browser to insert this thing called app inside the div with the ID of root. But what is this app thing? App is a component. When you build a component, you give it a name, and then when you want to use it, you put that name inside of angle brackets, just like a self-closing HTML tag. So app is a component, but where did the component come from? The app on line 7 is the same app that I imported from app.js up here. Let's flip over to app.js so that we can see how to write a very basic component. As you can see, the most basic components are just functions that do two things. First, they accept a single parameter. We've called that parameter props. And second, they return HTML. The only other thing we need before building a component is right here on line 1. We need to import React into any file in which we're going to write components. Now that we have a simple component, let's demonstrate using it in multiple places. Flipping back over to index.js, rather than having just one app component rendered to the screen, I'm going to have 3. The first parameter of the render function has to have just one outer node. So I'm going to first wrap the app component in a div. I'm going to put it on its own line so that it's also a little easier to read. Then, inside of that div, I'm going to repeat the app component 3 times. Notice that Hello World is now appearing on the screen 3 times. Let's make a more useful component, a button component. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is delete these extra apps. Move this back onto the same line just to shorten things up. And then let's go over to app.js and build a new component. So I'm just going to copy the basic framework that we have up here, paste it down here. We'll change this to be called button instead. And then instead of returning an h1 tag, let's have it return a div. And inside of the div, we'll write sign in. Okay, so we've created a new component, but you'll notice that you don't see sign in showing up on the screen over here. Why is that? Well, that's because if you look back at index.js, the only things that are going to show up on the screen are the things that ultimately relate back here to this render statement. And we're only rendering app. We're not rendering app and button. So we could do one of two things. We could put button inside of this div tag here, like this. We'd also need to import it up here. Okay, and then there is sign in. So that's one thing we can do. But one of the cool things about components is you can actually put components inside of components. And this is going to be the path that we're going to actually go down. So let's delete button out of here, go back over to app.js, and inside of app, rather than just returning this h1 tag, we're also going to return the button component. Now, similar to before, your return statement can only return one outer node. So our strategy there is to wrap everything in a div and then put everything inside of that div. Okay, so now I'm going to put button right here. And once again, sign in is showing up. Now I don't need to do any importing because button is already on this page. Button here refers to this function right here. So there's no import necessary. Button is already in this file and I can just reference it by putting the name surrounded by basically a self-closing HTML tag. All right, let's make this a little prettier. So first thing, this is a little bit messy, so I'm going to just wrap this in parentheses like this. And what that will allow me to do is I can now take this off of the same line and I can start to just really format this like I would normal HTML with indents and the other spacing that we're a little more used to. All right, that looks better. Now let's make our button actually look like a button. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'll add a property on here called style, and you can ignore the formatting for now. We'll talk about that in a second. But inside of the style tag, it should look similar to what you've done before, just with a little bit different syntax. So let's give it a background color. You'll notice that before, when we were writing these properties in HTML, there was hyphens. You can translate almost all those properties you were using before to the right syntax here by just making what's called camel case, where you get rid of the hyphen and then capitalize the words other than the first word. So we'll say background color, colon, and let's make it blue, comma. Let's give this a width of 100 pixels. Let's make the color, this is the font color, white. Let's add some padding, say 15 pixels. Let's click away from here so we can see what we're doing. All right, that's looking pretty good. Let's just center our text and put some border radius on those corners as well. So we'll say text align, center, and border radius, we'll say 15 pixels. How does that look? All right, that's looking like a pretty good button. So now that we have our component, which is a button, we can use that button as many times as we would like. You already saw how to do this with the app component. We can do here. And now we've got 2 buttons. Let's put another one on there. 3 buttons. I think you get the idea. Okay, so this is cool, but imagine if we could do something to customize each button. For example, what if we could make it so that this button said sign in, this one said sign out, and this one said something else, all using the same button component. And with React and components, we can do that using something called properties. Properties are, well, they're properties that you can pass to a component and then use them like variables. Remember, when we wrote our functions, we made them accept this thing called props. So all we need to do is figure out how to pass something in as props, and then we should be able to use it down here. And the way you do that is that when you use the component, you can just, inside of the tag, add a property that you want to pass down. So let's say I want to pass down a label text property, and I'm going to set that equal to, and you have to put it inside of curly braces. I'm going to say this one's going to be sign in. Okay. To this one down here, I'm going to pass the same thing. Let's actually just get rid of this 3rd button. This one, instead of saying sign in, I'm going to say sign out. All right, so then what React does is it will take these properties that I've created here, and it will put them into an object that is going to be this props thing that the function is receiving. So since props is an object, the way I access this is I would say props.labelText. So here, instead of doing it like this, I can now put inside of curly braces, I can say props.labelText. And check that out. Now it says sign in and sign out. So let's talk about those curly braces really quickly. So I've been cheating a little bit here and calling this stuff HTML. And that's because it looks a lot like HTML. It's actually not. What it actually is called is JSX. And what's cool about JSX versus HTML is that in addition to writing HTML-like stuff, we can also write JavaScript. We just have to put it inside of curly braces. So anytime we want to run something in JavaScript, if we put it inside of curly braces, then it will execute it. So take a look at what happens if I take these curly braces away. Now, instead of looking at this as an object and finding something inside of it, which is a JavaScript thing, it's just displaying the text, which is not what we want. So let's add those curly braces back here. And now, with that bit of insight, this style should make a little more sense. What we've said is style equals, and then curly brace. We're saying we want to run some JavaScript or write JavaScript code here. And then what we're doing is we're passing to it, the style thing, we're passing an object, which is also written with curly braces. That's why you have 2. So the first curly brace is to say we're going to run some JavaScript, and the second curly brace is the syntax for an object. And so that's why you're seeing the same syntax as an object, curly brace, colons, and commas. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so we're passing a property down here called labelText that we're then using right here. Let's pass some other things that would be helpful to customize. One thing that would be really helpful is to be able to customize what this button does when it's clicked. And so what we can do is we can pass functions down as properties just as easily as we can pass strings. So I'm going to write 2 different functions. up here that we're going to pass down. And when you're writing a function inside of a function, we typically use a little different notation. We use the arrow notation. So let's call this function handle click sign in, kind of a long name. We're handling what happens when you click on the sign in. I said equals parentheses, arrow, curly brace. And all we're going to do is we're going to use this native JavaScript function called alert that will basically pop up a alert message on the screen. And we're going to say sign in. Let's write another function now that we're going to call handle click sign out. Cool. So now we got two functions. One that when it is run will put up an alert that says sign in, and another will put up an alert saying sign out. All right, so now if we want to pass these functions down as properties, all I have to do is create a name for them. So let's call this, we'll just call it onClick. And what we're going to pass down is we're going to pass down the function that we just wrote, handle click sign in. And then for this one, we'll do the same thing. OnClick, we'll get a property that's called onClick, and pass down handle click sign out. Close my curly braces. And then in here, I just need to run that function. Okay, so inside of our button component, when do I want to run that function? Well, I want it to run whenever someone actually clicks on the div here. So the way I do that is that divs, like native HTML divs, actually accept a property called onClick. And maybe I should have named my property I'm passing down something else so it would be less confusing. But they have a native property called onClick that you can pass a function to, and it will run that function when the thing is clicked on. So inside of my onClick, I'm going to say onClick equals curly brace props dot onClick. Okay, so now the native onClick property is accepting or passing this function that we created up here and passed down through the properties. Let's see if it works. I'm going to click on sign in. Yep, there's my alert that says sign in. Click on sign out. There's my alert that says sign out. The last thing I want to show you about properties is kind of a special way that you can pass properties to a component. We've been passing them down by creating a name and setting it equal to something. The other way you can pass a property to a component is by, rather than using a self-closing tag like this, I can make it an opening tag and a closing tag, and then I can put something in between the two tags. So maybe I'll put sign in right here and get rid of the label text over here. Do the same for this component. Instead say sign out. And now, obviously down here, I'm going to have to change something as well. I'm not going to say props.labelText. Instead, if you pass something that way, it is always called props.children. And it looks like I forgot to delete that closing tag. So this is another way you can pass one property down. You can put it in between the two tags. When you would do this is purely a matter of personal preference. This would be a nice thing to do because it kind of simulates the underlying div. I'm putting the text in between these two divs, so it's kind of nice to be able to pass it down this way. Again, purely a matter of personal preference, but I want you to be aware of that because you will see this way of passing properties in the future. So these property things are really powerful. We can create a single component with standardized styling and then create these properties that we pass to that component that make it do different things. The next important feature of React components that you need to understand is something called state. To understand state, let's take a look at an example of a component in our authentication app. So here's our app. Remember when we click on the hamburger menu, it opens this thing that we call a drawer. The drawer is itself going to be a component. But what's unique about the drawer is that sometimes it's displayed on the screen and other times it's not. And so we need to have some sort of property that can control whether or not the drawer is open or closed. Now that's easy enough. We could put a property on our component that was called open and set it equal to true if we want the drawer to be open, and false if we want the drawer to be closed. But how are we going to change that value of the property? To date, if you remember, going back here, our properties, or the things that they're set equal to, are hard-coded. In this case, they're hard-coded equal to a function. Here, it's always going to be sign in or sign out. So we need a way of having properties change their value dynamically. And this is where state comes in. Let's build out a simple example to help you understand exactly how state works. So let's change our example a little bit here so that initially you only see the sign in button. When you click the sign in button, let's make it so that the sign in button disappears and the sign out button appears. Okay? And then when you click the sign out button, we'll make it so that the sign out button disappears and the sign in button appears. To make that happen, we're going to need some sort of property on our button to say whether or not it should be visible. So let's just create a property. We'll call it visible. And to start, we want this one to be visible. So we'll say it's true. And we want this one to start being not visible. So we'll say it's going to be false. Now, down here, we need to use that property to say whether or not to show something on the screen. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say if props.visible is true, then return back this div. And if it's false, return back an empty div. Okay, so we need to do an if statement, essentially. So to set that up, let's first put some parentheses around this so that we can move things onto a new line and see things a little better. I'm also going to close this over here so you can see a little bit more of my line. Okay, and we'll put the other parentheses down here. And so in here, inside of this return, on the outer side part of return, you always have to return a div. So we can't just start our if statement immediately. So we'll put a div here. And then inside of this div, let's write an if statement. And the way you write these if statements inside of JSX is a little different than you may be used to. But it's also one of the really cool things about JSX. Again, with JSX, we can write JavaScript right here in the middle of this HTML looking stuff, as long as we write some curly braces. So let's write a curly brace. And the format we use is we basically say condition, question mark, then what you want to do if it's true, and then else, which is the curly brace, what you want to do if it's false. So our condition is going to be props.visible. So props.visible will be true or false. So if it's true, then it will run this part, and if it's false, it will run this part. So when it's true, what we want to do is display all of this. I'm going to move this down to a new line, that down to a new line, that down to a new line. Let's put our button here in the true spot. So now if it's visible, it's going to display that. And if it's not, then we just want it to return an empty div, like that. Okay, so there you go. So now the sign in button is appearing, the sign out button is not. If I change this to be true as well, now they're both appearing. Okay, so the next step in this kind of logic would be to create a variable that both of these visible properties are set equal to, that we can then change to be the reverse of it. So let's do that. Let's create a variable up here that we're going to call const. Let's just call it signed out. And we'll start it equal to true. Because if we're signed out, then we want to display the sign in button, but not the sign out button. Okay? So let's set visible here equal to signed out. And then for this one, we're going to do a little trick here and say we're going to set it equal to the opposite of signed out. So the little exclamation point means not. So it will reverse a Boolean from false to true or true to false. Okay? So now it's doing exactly what we want. It starts off with sign in visible, sign out is not. Now we just need a way of changing this value from being true to false or false to true whenever you click on the button. So it's already quite handy that we have these functions that are going to run when you click on them. So instead of just running this alert, why don't we change the value of signed out? Okay, so since we're going to be changing the value of this variable, we can't say const, we have to say let. So that will allow us to change it. And in here we'll say, if you click on the sign in button, we want to change signed out to be false. And if you click on the sign out button, we want to change signed out to be true. Okay? So theoretically, that should work. We click on sign in, it should change this thing to false, and then that would reverse the value here, hiding this one and showing this one. Theoretically. Let's see if it works. Click sign in, nothing is happening. Now let's just make sure this function is actually running. So to do that, I'm going to put let's just do console.log, and let's log out a statement to our console that says signed in was clicked. Let's actually say sign in was clicked. Okay? And let's open up our console. I click it. Sure enough, sign in was clicked. So this function is running. It must be changing our value. Why is this not updating? Well, the answer is that our function at this point has already run and returned all of this content. It's too late to now go in and change what visible is equal to. And this is precisely why React has a concept of state. With state, you can set up special variables that work very much like this. They have a variable with an initial value and a function to change that variable. But what's special about them is that React watches these variables. And anytime they change value, it will then rerun your function with that new value and return the new display code, which would, in turn, update this to hide the sign in button and show the sign out button. Okay, so let's go through the syntax for how you set up these special state variables. I'm going to close my console. Let's delete this console.log statement. And the first thing we need to do is we need to import from our React dependency something that is called useState. There it is. And now let's come here, and instead of creating our variable like this, we're going to say const bracket the name of our variable, we'll call it signed out, and then the name of our function. And let's just call it set signed out. Okay, so this is the function that will change the value of signed out. And we say equals useState, and we pass useState what we want to be the initial value of our signed out variable, which is going to be true. Okay, so the initial value of signed out is going to be true. And when we want to change the value of signed out, we use this function that we've called setSignedOut. All right, so this is already working. This is pointing to the right variable. Now we just need to have these functions right here run this setSignedOut function. So when you click the sign in, we want to run the function setSigned out, and we want to set signed out to be false. So we're going to pass false in there. Here we'll run the function setSignedOut. In this case, we want to set it equal to true. Okay. Now we're using state rather than the simple variables that we created, and let's give it a try. I click sign in, it changed, and is now showing the sign out button. I click sign out, changed, and now is showing the sign in button. Okay, cool. So this is doing exactly what we want it to do, but let's take a second and go back and look at this funky syntax. Let's start right here with useState. useState is what we imported up here, and useState is a function. You can tell that because of the parentheses, right? This is the syntax you use when you want to run a function. So we are passing a value of true to this function called useState. useState now does essentially three things. First, it's going to create a variable and set it equal to the value that was passed in, or true. Let's call that variable foo, just for this example. So it creates a value called foo and sets it equal to true. The second thing it does is it creates a function that will change the value of foo. Okay? The third thing it does is it returns back an array that has foo and that special function that changes the value of foo. When a function returns an array, you can capture the values inside of that array like this. Const, bracket, then a name of whatever you want to call the first thing in the array, comma, a name of whatever you want to call the second thing in the array. So if useState had returned 3 values inside of the array, we could capture the third value by simply saying comma new. But it didn't, it only returned 2, so we write it like this. Okay, so that is state in a nutshell. We know how to set up these special variables that have special functions to change them, and React watches those variables for any time they change, and when they do, it reruns the function that they are inside of, which will return back the updated JSX with the properties now set to that new value. Hopefully by this point you are starting to realize how cool React is. It is awesome. And one of the coolest things about React is that you can build these components that you can use over and over again. You just saw that with the button. Now that we've built this button component, we could use that button component anywhere we need a button in our project, and it would save us a bunch of time of having to write all this custom code. In fact, if you were on a big development team that was using React, there would probably be somebody on that team or some buddies on that team responsible for building out all the common components that the app is going to use. The buttons, the dialog boxes, the input boxes, the switches, whatever else your app has that's going to be common and used in a lot of different places. Open source projects have also done the same thing. There are groups that have gotten together and in an open source way built component libraries for React. And we are going to use one of these libraries for our project, and it's going to save us a ton of time and make our apps look really nice in the process. The library we are going to use is called Material UI. Material UI is called that because Google released some design guidelines called Material Design. And it's basically their thoughts on how everything should look on an app. So if you're building apps for Android, you follow these design guidelines so that everything kind of has a consistent look and feel. So this is the website for Material UI. In the hamburger menu on the left are some really helpful resources. First off, they have component demos. This shows all the different things you can use Material UI to build. So let's just take a look at one of these. Here are their pre-built dialogues. So here we can click on this and you can see what it looks like. They've got an AppBar here. What's nice about these demos is you can click this little code icon here and it will show the source and how to build these things. So you can actually see that this AppBar is actually composed of a bunch of components. It's got the AppBar component that has a property on it. Inside of it, it's got another component called Toolbar, which inside of it has this thing called Icon Button that has a menu icon inside of it, and icon button, typography, etc. All of these things are components that are part of the Material UI library. So those are the demos. Below them are the component API. What they've done is they've gone through each of the components that they built, like the AppBar, and they describe the properties that you can pass to it and what values you can pass to those properties. So for example, with the AppBar, you can pass a position property, and it can be equal to fixed, absolute, sticky, static, and relative. Basically, this property will determine how the AppBar behaves and where it's positioned on the screen. Okay, so this is Material UI. The tip I would give you for building things is come here to the component demos, find something that you're trying to build, say like a dialog box, look at one that you like, then go in here to the source code. You can see all the import statements up here that you're going to need. Copy all of the import statements. Then forget all of this other stuff. They write things a little differently than we do. And go down to where you see the code, okay? Come in here, copy all of this, then go through these properties and delete off most everything, okay? Maybe even just delete off everything, just so that you have kind of the components just nested together, no properties. Then go into the component APIs and say, what properties do I actually need for the dialog box to work? And maybe actually just start with the ones that are here. Say, do I need open? Yes, I do need open. Do I need on close? What does that do? Do I need this area labeled by? No, I don't. This other area? No, I don't. Do I need these IDs? No, I don't need these IDs. Take all that stuff off, simplify it down, and then add more stuff if you need them based on the component API. Okay, we are finally to the moment you have all been waiting for. We're going to actually start building our authentication app. So since it's been a little while since we talked about what it actually looks like, let's go back to that demo and remind ourselves. The first page that the user is brought to is a sign-in page. If you go to the sign-up page, it looks exactly the same, just with a couple different words. Back on sign-in, if we sign in, that's going to take us here. That has an app bar with a title, a little hi message for the user that's signed in, a sign out button, and this drawer with some options. Okay, so essentially what we have here is we have 3 pages. We have the sign in page, the sign up page, and then this signed in view. So to start building this out, let's create 3 components, one for each of those pages. All right, so let's delete out all the stuff that we don't need. Get rid of our button. This is going to start throwing errors because it doesn't know what that is anymore. We'll delete that. We don't need any of these functions. Get rid of all of that. Okay, so now we are back to a basic component. So let's take this here, copy it, and create 2 more of these. Let's call the first one sign in, the second one sign out, and the last one app. Okay, and then let's start building. Let's start with the sign in page. I'll delete our H1, and just so we can see what we're building, remember it's showing hello world over here because that's what app says. So we can see what we're building. Let's go to index.js, and rather than rendering app, let's import sign in and render sign in instead. Okay, so back over here on app.js, now the hello world is gone. Let's start using Material UI to build this. Let's look at the page. Here's the page that we're trying to build. So the first thing we're going to need is this bar at the top. That is called an app bar. Let's go over here, look at our demos. Here's an app bar. Let's open this up. Like I said, let's go down to where they've written the code and just copy it here. Go back over here, and I'm going to paste this in here. Notice we get a bunch of errors. App bar is not defined. That's because whenever you use something Material UI, you have to import it first. And let's take a look to see what's going on here. So notice that in our dependencies, we do have Material UI as one of our dependencies. So we're going to be able to import files from Material UI. So let's go back over here, grab the relevant import statements, AppBar, Toolbar, and Typography. I'm going to copy those, bring it back over here, and paste it right there. And there is exactly the AppBar from the Material UI demo. That was really easy. Let's change a couple things now so it says what we want it to say. We want it to say sign in up here. That. And we want the color to not be white. We want it to be blue. So let's go look and see what's controlling the color of the app bar. I'm guessing it's this property called color, but just to demonstrate, let's go over to the component API, go down to AppBar, and look what our options are. Inherit, primary, secondary, and default. Material UI has a theme that has a primary color, a secondary color, and a default color. The primary color is blue. I think the default color is white, and the secondary color, I believe, is pink. So, if we go back over here, if instead of saying color default, we just say primary, now we have a blue bar. Just to check, let's see what secondary does. Sure enough, it changes to that kind of pink color. Okay, so let's change this back to primary. Now we have our app bar that says sign in. That looks just like the example here. Let's keep moving. So down below our app bar, we want to have this little thing here. And what that is called in Material UI land is paper. So if we go back over here, you will see a piece of paper. This is a sheet of paper, okay? So you come down here. We actually don't need any of the text on it. all you need for a paper is just the paper component. So let's grab it here. We're going to paste it up here. And just one thing to note so that you can kind of detect the pattern is that the file structure is @material UI/core, and then the capitalized name of whatever the component is. That's where you're going to import from. These are default exports because we're not using the curly braces. So we could actually name this thing foo, and it would still import the paper component, right? But that would be confusing. So we'll just call it paper. And so then down here, let's say paper. Close it, paper. And we don't see anything yet. That's because there's nothing inside of our paper. Let's just, so we can get things to start showing up, let's put hello world. And there you go. Now we have our paper with hello world inside of it. Looking at this though, we don't want our paper to be spanning the entire screen, and we also want it to be centered with some space between the app bar and here. So to do this, we're going to use just ordinary HTML stuff and ordinary flexbox stuff from CSS. So in order to get this thing to be a certain width, we can do that with the style property. Remember, when you use style, you need to do the curly braces because we're going to write JavaScript, and then we're going to write an object. So that's the second set of curly braces. And we're just going to say width, and I'm not sure how wide that is, but I'm going to guess it's around 300 pixels. Okay, and we want a gap between this piece of paper and the app bar. So let's put a margin top, and I don't know, let's say that's about 50 pixels. Okay, so that pushes it down. Now we need to center this. Whenever you're trying to position things on the page, you almost always are going to want to use Flexbox. Since we want to center this, let's put our paper inside of a Flexbox. So I'm going to create a div around my paper that will be my Flexbox. Tab this over so we know that it's inside. I'm going to say style equals curly brace, display, flex. So now this div is a Flexbox, and the things inside of it will be flex items. If I want to center everything inside of the Flexbox, I'm going to say comma, justify content, center. Cool. That's positioned in the right place. Let's do one more thing. Let's make our paper have some padding so that it pushes the content away from the edges. So say padding, and I don't know, 30 pixels should be good. Oops, not PC, 30 pixels. There we go. Awesome, that's looking good. Let's hop back over here. And on second inspection, I bet you this thing is bigger. One way we can check that is we can say inspect in Chrome and highlight it, and it'll tell us. Yeah, it says it's 480 pixels wide. So let's make ours 480 pixels wide. So now we just need to add a text field, two text fields, this and the button. So we hop back over here and look at our text fields. All right, so here's a text field right here. Let's grab that, put it into our paper. We want two of these. We're getting the error because we haven't imported it yet. Come up here and grab the import statement. And like I said, sometimes you want to come in here and delete out all of the stuff. Okay, so now we have, let's go look at the component API and see what options we have available for customizing this thing. All right, there it is. And let's see here. We want some text to just kind of show here as a placeholder. And sure enough, there's a property called placeholder. We can pass it a string, and this is the short hint that will be displayed in the input before the user enters a value. Sounds like just what we want. So we go here to text field, and I say placeholder equals email. There it is. Looks like I capitalized email. And on this one here, let's say placeholder equals password. So we want our text fields to go the full width of the screen. I wonder if there is a property for that. There is. Full width. If set to true, it will take the full width of its container. So let's add on full width equals curly brace true. Really quickly a point here. So notice that I didn't put the curly braces around this value here. When what you're setting it equal to is just a string, you can omit the curly braces, but you can also include them if you wanted to. So that will also work. Okay, so let's add a full width equals true here as well. And now our text fields are taking the entire width of the screen. It looks like I added a little space between the email and the password, so let's do that. On our text field here, we'll add a style, curly brace, put my closing ones as well, margin, top, and I don't know, let's do like 30 pixels. Cool. Now we've got some good space there. Down below here, we want to add this little message with a link and a button. So notice that these are both on the same line, and they're arranged so that this is pushed to the left and this is pushed to the right. That sounds like Flexbox for me. So what we want to do is, instead of just creating these two elements, we want to put them inside of a Flexbox that can then position them with space between. Okay, so I'm going to create a div that's going to be my Flexbox. We'll say style equals curly brace, display, flex. We'll close that up. And then inside of the div, I need two things. I need that text, and I also need the button. So on Material UI, there is something called typography that is useful for text. Now you could just write the text inside of a div if you wanted to, but what typography is nice for is it's a good way of standardizing your text across your app. So for example, you can use this variant property on it and set it equal to H1, and then it will make it the size of whatever your H1 is set to in this theme, right? Or you can set it equal to display 4 and it will be that size, or headline or title, okay? So typography is nice in that it allows you to easily standardize your font sizing and weights and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to use that here. I'm going to say typography and that. And now what's interesting here, remember we talked about this with the button. You can sometimes pass properties inside of the tags. And that's called children, right? So here is the node you want. This is the content of the component, okay? So this is how this one is built. It's the text that you want to display. Rather than putting it as some value in a property, you just put it inside of the tags as the children. Okay, so what do we want this to say? We want it to say, don't have an account, question mark, sign up. Don't have an account, sign up. Okay, that's on the screen now. We also want a button. And as you probably could guess, there is a component called button right here. It also uses the children for the content of the button. So like the text that you want to appear. So let's do that. We're going to say button, closing like that. There you go. We just need to import it up here now. I'm just going to copy this line here because I understand the pattern now. We're going to say button and button right here. And on our button, we want this to say sign in, right? Cool. So now we want them to be spaced apart. So the way we do that is we can say justify, this is Flexbox stuff, justify content, space between. Okay, so now they're pushed away from each other. We also wanted to line up vertically. And the way you do that is with align items center. All right, so now they are aligned up vertically. The last thing we probably want is a little bit of space between this line and this line. So on our Flexbox, let's just add one more thing to push the box and everything in it down. We'll say margin top 30 pixels. All right, cool. Now our button doesn't look like this button, so let's go look at the component API for button and see what we need to change. Looks like it does have a color option as well with those same things, secondary, primary, inherit, and default. So my guess is if we want it to be blue, we're going to need to add a color on here and set it equal to, look at our editor's smart, it knows the options, set it equal to primary. Oh, that changed the text, not the actual color of the entire button, so let's keep looking. Down here you also have this thing called variant, and this is what we want. We want it to be a raised button here. So let's go in here and say variant equals raised. There we go. Now it looks like the button right over here. We're going to skip making that a link for now because that's the subject of a later lesson, but there you go. We now have the sign-in page looking just like the sign-in page from our example app. So we're making good progress here. One thing I noticed is there was an error down here in the console, and it says the raised variant will be removed in the next major release. Contained is equivalent and should be used instead. So let's change this here from being raised to being contained. Okay, let's move on to our sign up page. And I'm realizing right now that we shouldn't have called this thing sign out. We should call it sign up. That's what it is. And this is going to be super simple. Let's just copy everything up here inside of our return and put it down here. Now our sign up will be exactly like our sign out so that we can see what we're doing. Let's go back to index.js. Let's also import sign up and change this to be sign up so that we can see what we're doing. We will flip back over here and sure enough, nothing changed. So let's go now and make the tweaks that we need. So the first one is here. Rather than saying sign in, we want to say sign up. And here, rather than saying sign in, we want to say sign up. And then I think the last thing we need to do is change our little message. We want to say, what do we say? We say, already have an account, sign in. Okay, so already have an account, sign in. And eventually that will be a link back over to the other side. Cool, so that was the sign up page. That was easy. Let's work on the last part of this, which is going to be the signed in view. So let me sign in. Let's start with the AppBar. So what I would do here is I'd probably just copy the AppBar we already built down here. Oh, and since we're going to be building our app, let's go over here and change this so that we can see the app. And what do we say? We called it just my app in the typography. Okay, so at this point, we now need to add the drawer, or the icon for the drawer, this message here, and the sign out button. Sign out button is probably the easiest, so let's do that one first. We already know how to build buttons, so I'm going to go down here and say button, sign out. Okay, and that put it right here next to it. And notice that the text is black. Just to save us some time, we're going to say color equals, and we want to change it to inherit. And what that does is it's going to make the color the same color as the text of the thing it's on. And you can see the default color for the text in a toolbar or on an app bar is this white. So that's what the color inherit is doing. Now we want to push them apart from each other. So what we can do here is we can use a little flexbox trick, which is we can take the typography here and we can say we want you to take up all of the extra space. Hopefully you remember this from your flexbox practice. And so the way you do that is you go over here and you say style flex grow 1. Okay, and so now the typography is taking up all the extra space. And so if we were to inspect this, you would see this typography element taking up all this space here. Okay, let's add that little message. We'll just use that typography here again. And inside of here it said hi, and then the username. So let's just hard code it for now. Eventually this will actually be dynamic, but we'll hard code the username that was put in there. And it's also black, so let's do the same color thing. If you looked at the docs, you would see it has this same property. Okay, that's now white, and I feel like we want a little bit of space between that message and the button here. So let's add inside of our style on this typography guy. Let's say style margin right, I don't know, 30 pixels. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Last thing we need is we need to add this icon and the icon button. The Material UI component for this button here is called an icon button. Right here. And you'll notice here that what we need to pass to it in the children, so in between the icon button tags, is the actual icon element. Flipping back over to our project, you'll see that in addition to importing Material UI/core, we've also imported Material UI/icons. This library contains all of the icons that Google has designed for material design. You can actually see them here if we Google material design icons. There's a whole website for them. There's a little filter box over here that you can search for ones you're looking for. So I bet this one is some sort of menu icon. Sure enough, it's actually just called menu. So these icons that we've imported, the way you find them is actually by this name right here. You're going to say import, let's just call it menu icon, from @material UI/icons/ menu. I'm waiting for the auto-populate, maybe it's a capital M. /menu. Okay. Now remember, this, when you don't use the curly braces, that means this must be a default export. So you can call this whatever you want to. I prefer not to call it menu. Like up here we're calling this button and button. That's fine. I prefer not to call this menu because then it will get conflated with the menu component. So the convention that I usually use is to say the name of the icon, capital I icon. Okay? So here in our toolbar, down here, before the typography, we want to add an icon button. I have to import that, I'm realizing. And then inside of it, you're going to put the menu icon. Close it up, icon button. We'll head back up here. And if we import the icon button, then we should be good to go. Okay, there we go. Notice there's the icon right there. It's coming from the menu icon, and we've got the button. Now, again, we've got the color issue again. So if we come back down here to the icon button, we should be able to say color equals inherit, and that will change it white. So this is looking pretty close. We added a little bit of space here between our typography and our button. So let's go ahead and do that here as well. So we'll just add a margin left of, say, 30 pixels. And that will push it over. All we need to do now is add our drawer. So our drawer is not going to go inside of our app bar. It's going to appear, obviously, just to the side of it. So what we're going to do is down below the app bar, let's go and add a drawer. Okay, so here we are. We want it to open from the left-hand side. So this first example in the source should be more or less what we want. So scrolling down, here's our return. There's those buttons that were just on the screen. And here is our first drawer. Let's just grab this guy here. We'll copy it. And we will paste it right here. So this side list thing is a variable they must have defined. Okay, actually, let's get rid of all this stuff inside of here. All together, we're going to put our own stuff inside of the drawer. And they're using two properties here. They're using an open property and an on-close property. We actually are going to need both of those. Let's just go look at the API so we can understand what those do. We'll start with open. Open is a Boolean, so a true-false field. It defaults to being false or closed. If you change it to true, the drawer will open. So we did this in our state example, or something very similar to it. So what we're going to want to do is let's just change the value here. We're going to just hard code it equal to true so we can see the drawer. And then, let's import it. It's saying it's not defined. So let's go up here and import a drawer. Okay. And then this whole toggle drawer thing, let's delete what it's set equal to out. It's probably going to need to have a function in here. Let's go look at it. So on close, it says it needs to be receiving a function. And this function is going to be called when the component requests to be closed. So what this function will need to do is it will need to basically change the state of whatever value we're using here to being false again. So for now, let's just take the property off. We'll add it back later. Let's just make sure our drawer is actually even working. Okay, it looks like it's open. It's definitely got this overlay. We're not seeing the white box, and that's probably just because we don't have anything inside of our drawer. Let's just, for now, let's just put a div inside of here that says hello. And there, now we have a drawer that you can see. Okay, so what we are going to need to do now is set up one of those special state variables that we can change and therefore toggle when the drawer is either opened or closed. So to remind you how you do that, we've already imported the useState function that we'll need for this. Down here in app, we're going to say const bracket, and then we need to name what we want our special variable to be. I'm just going to call it drawer underscore open. Okay. Then we need to name our function, and I usually follow a kind of a convention like this. We'll just say set drawer open equals use state, and then we need to pass it the initial value for drawer open. And we want our initial value to be false because we don't want our drawer to be open when we come to the screen. So, all right, so we've set up our state variable now. Now, rather than open being hard-coded to true, we want to set it equal to this variable that we created here, drawer open. And now, we just need to change the value of drawer open to true to get it to open. So when are we going to want to set drawer open to true? We want to set it open to true whenever someone clicks on this icon button. So let's go to the icon button and add a function called onClick, and let's write a function up here that we're going to call const handle menu click equals parentheses arrow curly braces, and what we want this function to do is we want it to set drawer open to true, right? And so then in this onClick, all we have to do is pass in the handle menu click. Okay, so now if I click over here, it does. It opened my drawer. Now notice I can't close my drawer, and that is because I have not set up the onClose property of my drawer. So going back over to drawer, remember it has a property called onClose that you need to pass a function to that will run when the drawer requests to be closed. And so this function, what it needs to do is it needs to run set drawer open with false. So let's come here and say const handle close drawer parentheses arrow curly brace, and here we want to say set drawer open with a false inside of it, and I'm going to pass that to the onClose property handle close drawer. Okay, so now with that done, I can click on the icon, it opens the drawer. I now click on the overlay and it closes the drawer. Before we move on, let me now describe a shorter way to write these same functions using what are called anonymous functions. You can see here that our functions have names. We call this one handle menu click and this one handle close drawer. An anonymous function is just the part of the function after the equal sign. And so what we can do, instead of naming a function here and then referencing it here, we can take this whole section, copy it, and put it inline right here. I'll get rid of this extra spacing. And you can see now we are writing the function right here in line with what is called an anonymous function because it's not named. So notice I can still click here and it will still open the drawer. With that copied there, I can now delete my function here. Let's bring the anonymous part of this function down here as well. Delete the extra space. Delete the function. And let's test to make sure it still works. And it does. I point this out for two reasons. One, because you'll often see this in code, and I want you to understand what it does. And two, it's actually really handy when you're doing something really short and simple like this. Rather than having to define a function and reference it, you can just put it right in line inside of the onClick property. So far, to see the different pages of our app, like sign in, sign up, or app, we have been manually changing the component that is rendered right here. Now, obviously, that is not a good solution. Ideally, the various links and buttons, like this sign out button, would take us to the different areas of our app. And even more ideally, when we go to a new page, the URL would change to be a unique URL associated with that page. Before I walk through our solution to how we're going to do that, let me share with you one small piece of web history. When websites were first built, they were built as a series of HTML pages, linked together with hyperlinks. Those HTML pages were often stored in a file system, and so the URL often reflected the path to the new HTML page. Our app isn't built that way. In fact, it has just one HTML page, this index.html. Our app is what you call a single page application. What we're thinking of as new pages aren't really new pages at all. They're just components being rendered by JavaScript. So we could write some JavaScript code that would allow different components to be displayed when different buttons are written, and nothing would have to happen with the URL. But we're not going to do that, because users have grown accustomed to the URL changing when a new, quote, page shows up on the web. It's nice for them. They can then take that unique URL and send it to somebody, and they'll land on the same exact spot of the website that that person was viewing. So we want a solution that changes the URL in accordance with the location that is being displayed in the app. If we had to build a solution like that ourselves, it'd be pretty tricky, but fortunately there's a package pre-built just for this purpose, and it's called React Router. You'll notice here on the left that React Router is already included in our dependencies, so we are ready to go to start using it in our app. To use React Router, there's just a little bit of setup that you'll need to do, and then there are two concepts that you'll need to understand. Let's do the setup first. To be able to use React Router in my app, I need to wrap the component that my render function is returning, this is an index.js, with a new component called browser router. Don't worry about what it does, it just has to be there for the other components to work. So first, let's import this component from our library. Say import, curly brace, browser router from React Router DOM. Now, around these div tags, I'm going to put browser router and that's all I need to do. My app is now set up to use React Router for navigation. Now let's talk about those two concepts. They are link and route. Link is a component that works a lot like the anchor component, or the A component, from HTML. You can wrap something that you want the user to click on in a link component, and then when they click on it, it will change the URL in accordance with whatever URL is specified in that link component. Now, to be very clear, all the link component does is change the URL. It doesn't change the display, doesn't take you to somewhere else. All it does is change the URL. To demonstrate this, let's wrap our sign out button in a link and have it change the URL to be this URL /foo. Okay, so we'll flip back over to app.js. At the top, we'll need to import the link component. So import curly brace link from React Router DOM. Now let's go down and find our sign out button, which is in our app component, and it's this button right here. So I'm going to wrap the button in a link, and then on the link I need a property. It's actually telling me right here that I need to specify the to property. So I'm going to say to, and then in quotes I'm going to write out the URL that I want it to take me to. So I'm going to say /foo. Now, if I come over here, you can see it changed the styling of my button a little bit. We'll talk about how to fix that in a second. But now if I click on sign out, notice that my URL changed to /foo. Nothing else changed about my app. All that changed was the URL changed to /foo. The second concept is a route. A route component watches the URL, and when it matches a specified pattern, it will render the content that it wraps to the screen. To demonstrate this component, we're going to make a route that will render hello world right here if the URL is /foo. Okay, so to get started, we'll need to import route from React Router DOM. Then we'll go down to the spot in our code where we want the content to appear, which is here, which is right here inside of the app component. We'll put it right below drawer. We'll type out route, which is a self-closing component. And now route needs two properties. The first is path. Path is the URL pattern at which you want this route to render its content. So we want it to render whenever the URL is /foo. The second property is called render. And render accepts a function that returns the content that you want displayed to the screen. Now we could write this function somewhere else, but I'm going to write an anonymous function just right here in line. So we'll do parentheses, arrow, curly brace, return, and then right inside of this return we need to return the content we want to display to the screen. So we're going to put an h1 tag. And inside of the h1 tag, we'll say hello world. Cool. So our route is now set up. Notice hello world is not on the screen, as it should not be, because our URL is not /foo. So now I'll click sign out, which changed my URL to /foo, and then the route recognized that and rendered hello world. Again, routes have a path that describes the pattern of the URL at which the route should render its content to the screen. If the pattern doesn't match, it does not render. If it does, it renders the content. Let's set up our app now so that it renders the different pages at different URLs for our site. So we'll go back over to index.js. What I'm going to do is inside of browser router, I am going to set up 3 routes. You'll notice here it's saying route is not defined. We need to import it up here at the top. And now I'm going to specify 3 different paths. The first path is going to be just the root. The page here that we want to render will be the page that we want to render at our root. I think that's going to be the sign-in page. Now we'll set up a path for /sign up. And at this path, we want to render the sign up page. Finally, let's set up a path for /app. And at this path, we want to render the signed in, or our app component. Okay? So now what we need to do is let's get rid of this here. And as you can see on the right, it's complaining that a router can only have one child element. So let's fix that by just wrapping these routes inside of a div. Cool. And now it has just one child element. So now at this point, our routes are missing that second parameter called render. So we're going to add that in. Render, curly brace. Remember, we're going to write an anonymous function here. Parentheses, arrow, curly brace, return, parentheses. And now in here, we just need to put the component that we want it to return. So at our root, or the slash, we want it to return the sign in component. So we'll just type sign in here. It's a self-closing tag. Okay, so now our sign in component is appearing on the screen. But why? Our URL is /foo, and we said it should render when the path is slash. This is because the way these paths work is they will render as long as the URL starts with and matches the pattern here. So I could have /foo, /boo, /moo, and this pattern would still match. If we wanted to only match and render when the path is exactly a slash with nothing else after it, then we need to add in front of path the word exact. Now you'll notice that sign in has disappeared from the page. This is the behavior that we want, because otherwise, when the path was /signup, it would render the component that we specify here, as well as the component that we specify here. So we do want exact path equals slash. Let's fix our URL. And sure enough, the sign in component shows up on the screen. Let's keep moving. So now for the sign up route, we want to render equals curly brace, parentheses, arrow, curly brace, return, parentheses, and this time we want it to render the sign up component. Cool, so let's just test this out. I'm going to manually change the URL to be sign up and hit enter. And sure enough, it renders my sign up component. Moving right along, we will do the render on this last route. Render equals curly brace, parentheses, arrow, curly brace, return, and this time we want to return the app component. Let's check this. We'll change this to say /app. And sure enough, it's now rendering my app component. Cool. Now, all of this seems like a lot of syntax to render just a single component, and it is. Because of this, React Router has built in a special property for rendering single components. What you can do is you can replace this entire render statement, or render property, with a property that's called component. You say component equals curly brace, and then the name of the component without any of the angle brackets. Let's go through and change all of these. I guess before I delete this last one, let's talk about why we would use this longer syntax. The longer syntax is helpful if you wanted to just put some custom stuff in here without actually building a component. You could say div hello world, and you could put other stuff in here as well. So it's helpful when you want to kind of on the fly return back something rather than having to build a component for it. We're not doing that though, so let's delete it out and instead just write component equals curly brace app. Okay, so we have our routing all set up. Now we just need to add our links. And remember, all links do is they change the URL. Let's flip back over to app.js and go through and add links where we need them. So I'll scroll to the top and let's look through the sign-in component for areas that need links. The first one I see here is on this sign-in button. So let's add a link around it. And we want this button to take us to app, because that's our signed in view. I also need one right around this sign up word, so I'm going to say link and this time we want to be to the sign up URL. We'll need to do something similar down here on the sign up page. We'll add a link around the sign in text. This one we want to take us to just back to the root, and the sign up button we want to take us to the Continuing on down, I think the only thing we need here is, well, I guess first delete this route that we have of hello world, is the button right here, which we already added a link to. When you sign out, we want you to take back to slash. All right, I think that's all the links. Let's test it out and make sure. So I click sign out, that takes me to sign in. I click sign in, that takes me to the signed in view. Sign out again. Sign up takes me to sign up. Sign up takes me to the app. Let's see, the last thing to test is we'll go back to sign up and check if this goes back to sign in. And it does. Okay, so all of our linking is working. It's changing our URLs. Our routes are looking at the URLs and rendering the correct content appropriately. The last thing to do is to fix our formatting. Notice how when we added these links to our buttons, it messed them all up and added these funny underlines, which we don't want. And in here, it changed the color as well. To fix this problem is actually really easy. Material UI, knowing that a lot of people use React Router, have built in some special properties to their components that allow us to add links without messing up the formatting. Here's how you do it. Instead of wrapping the button in this link component, instead what we'll do is add a property that's called to, and just say where we want it to take us to. This is the sign out button, so we want to take it to slash. And then we have to add another component, or another property that is called component, and set that equal to the link component. So just like that, no angle brackets, component equals curly brace link. Now notice that our sign out button looks normal again, and when I click it, it takes me to the right place. I'm going to quickly go now and fix these other links to be the same way. I'm actually just going to copy this to property out of this one here and paste it onto here. We'll add component equals curly brace link, and now we'll delete the links that are wrapping it. And our last one is right here. Delete that off. Delete that off. We're going to say to /app component equals curly brace link. And with that, I think everything should look normal. That button looks good. That button looks good. Still taking us to the right place. This button looks good. All right, everything's working. Formatting is good. That's React Router in a nutshell. All right, we have come a long way. We are now ready to integrate our app with Firebase for some real authentication. If you remember back a few videos ago, we talked about this file over here called firebase.js. Firebase.js is responsible for initializing our connection with Firebase and setting us up to use its products. Here on lines 5 through 13, we have a config object that has all the keys and URLs necessary to point our code to the right Firebase project. And then on line 15, we actually initialize that connection. Lines 17 and 19 are accessing two products inside of Firebase, one called Auth or Authentication and one called Firestore. That's going to be our database. We're creating constants equal to these things and we're exporting them. This is so that we can use Authentication and Firestore in our other files. So let's do just that. Let's hop back over to app.js where we want to use Authentication, and let's import that auth variable that I just created. So we'll say import auth from, and the Firestore file that we did that in is in the same folder as app.js, which is what I'm in right now. So we can say ./Firebase. All right, now we have access to that auth constant that I exported on the other file. So what is this auth constant that I created? If you looked at the Firebase documentation, you would see that auth is an object. And inside of that object are several functions for dealing with authentication. We're going to use 4 of those functions. One is for signing in, one is for creating accounts, one is for signing out, and the last one is for watching for changes in our authentication state. We'll talk a little bit more about that last one in a minute. Okay, so the first thing we're going to want to do is be able to sign in. So inside of our sign in page, I'm going to create a function that I'll call handle sign in. And I'm going to want to run this function when the user clicks the sign in button. What I want this function to do is I want it to call Firebase and send it my username and password. The name of the function inside of the auth object that does that is called sign in with email and password. So to run that function, I simply say auth, which is referencing the auth that I imported, dot, since it's an object, and then the name of the function, sign in with email and password. It's a function that we're running, so I'm going to put parentheses. And this function needs me to pass it two parameters. Not surprisingly, the email and the password. So for right now, I'm just going to kind of stub that out, and I'll write email password. Now you'll notice here that my editor is underlining this in red, and it's saying that this doesn't refer to anything. So we're going to have to somehow come up with the email and password that's been typed, but we'll come back to that in a second. Okay, so at this point, we have written a function that will run this function, sign in with email and password, which will send the email and password that I've typed off to Google servers to check if that thing is valid, and if it is, it will sign the user in. Okay, so that's great. I could very simply now take this handle sign in function, and I want to run it when someone clicks on the sign in button. So I'm going to add the onClick property here, equals, curly brace, handle sign in. So now when someone clicks on the sign in button, let's actually hop back over to that page so you can see what we're talking about. When someone clicks on this button here, it will run this function and try to sign the user in. When I'm done signing it in, I want it to take me to the signed in view. The problem I have right now is how do I know when it is done signing me in? What's handy about all of these Firebase functions is they allow you to use syntax that looks like this. After I run the function, I can say .then, open parentheses, close parentheses, and .catch, open parentheses, close parentheses. Inside of the .then, I can write a function, like an anonymous function, like this. And this function will run as soon as this is done signing me in. So inside of here, what I could do is I could write some code that would then navigate me to our new screen. So I'm just going to put a comment here that tells me that that's what I want to do here. Navigate to my new screen. Now what happens if my sign-in attempt was unsuccessful? Well, if it was unsuccessful, it's going to, rather than run my then code, it's going to run whatever code I have inside of my catch. So again, inside of catch, I can put an anonymous function, and I can do something inside of here. And so what I probably want to do inside of here is display some sort of error message so that the user knows to re-enter their email and password. Okay, so to review, auth.sign in with email and password is going to send my email and password off to Google servers to try and sign me in. If it successfully signs me in, then it will run whatever code is inside of this then. If it's unsuccessful, it will run the function inside of catch. Okay, one more thing to do before we work on getting the email and password to actually exist. Right now, our button is going to navigate me to /app as soon as I click on it. We don't want that to happen. We don't want to go to /app until we've successfully signed in. So I'm going to take those two properties off. Okay, so now we're ready to figure out how to get the email and password so that we can pass it to this function. To do that, we need to somehow be able to capture the value that is being typed here. To do that, we're going to set up two special state variables, one for email and one for password. So we'll say const, bracket, email, comma, and the name of the function that we want to use to change the email, set email is what I'll call it, equals use state, and then the initial value for our email, which is going to be just blank. All right, now we'll create another variable for the password, const, bracket, password, set password, equals use state, and we'll set the initial value for our password to blank as well. Okay, so now that we've got these two variables, the goal is to get whatever we type in the email field to be stored in this variable by using the setEmail function to update email. Same thing for password. Fortunately, our text fields right here, which is what this is right here, and the password text field, which is this one here, have two properties that allow us to intercept the keystrokes and store them somewhere else. The first one is called value. I'm going to say value equals curly brace, and we want to set value equal to the place that we're going to be storing our data, which in this case is this email variable. So we'll say value equals curly brace email, and then there is a second property that's called onChange, and this needs to receive a function that can update our email value. So we're going to say equals curly brace, and I'm going to write an anonymous function in here. And what I want this function to do is to update my email variable with the new value that has just been typed. So I'm going to say set email parentheses, and now I need my new value. Where do I get that from? Well, what's going to happen is TextField, when it runs this function, it's going to pass the new value into it inside of an object that's called E. And this part you're just going to have to remember, but E is an object that is really nested. The value we want is inside of e.target.value. So e.target.value will be the new value of the text field. We're going to send that to the setEmail function, which will change my email variable to be the new value. Okay, let's just see if this is still working here. Yep, this is still working just like before. What you can't see though is that now the stuff I typed is being stored in this email variable. Okay, let's do the same thing for the password. I'm just going to actually copy this whole bit here. I'll change the value to be password and the onChange to be set password. And then e.target.value is good to go. Okay, so now we've got a variable for email and password. Notice that the red underline is now gone. So this should work. Let's give it a try. The only way we're going to know if it worked, though, is if we put some logging inside of these functions, since they're not doing anything right now. So we'll say console.log sign in successful. Okay. Down here, we'll do console.log. And what's actually nice about the function that we'll run here is it will pass us an object that has the error message inside of it. So we're going to just call that object that we're going to receive error. And then in the log statement, we're going to say error.message. All right, let's open up our console and give this a try. Say chris.crittenden@gmail.com. And I'm going to put in an incorrect password for now and say sign in. There you go. The password is invalid, or the user does not have a password. So that's the error message that came back. Let's try putting in my actual password, which is just testing. Notice that we actually don't want this to happen here. We want to hide the password when it's being typed. We'll take care of that in a second. Now let's click sign in. Sign in successful. Cool. Nothing happened, of course, because that's all we're doing is logging it out. What we really want to have happen here is have it navigate us to the new location. We'll talk about how to do that in just a second. But before we do, let's get the sign up function working. And just to note, the only reason this worked is because I've actually been using this database already and have created a user account. You will not have any user accounts, so you won't have any way of getting this message of sign in successful because you don't have any user accounts to sign in against. So let's take care of that right now, and let's go and update our sign up page with similar code so that we can actually create new accounts. I'm going to copy everything from these constants that we created down through this function, and I'm going to paste it down here in our sign up. We're going to need to update, just so we can see what we're doing, we're going to need to update these same text fields that we did on the sign in field, same thing down in the sign up. So I'm going to copy those and overwrite the ones that are here. All right. So now we've got our special state variables, email and password. Our text fields are updating those as you type. Let's change this function to be called handle sign up. And let's run that function inside of the sign up button. So we'll say on click equals curly brace handle sign up. Let's get rid of the link. All right, now we are almost good to go. The last thing we need to do is change our function. We don't want to sign in with email and password. Instead, we want to create user with email and password. So let's delete this and we'll say create user with email and password. That's the name of the function inside of this auth object for creating new users. And it, just like our other one, needs us to pass the email and password to it. Let's change this so it can say create user successful, and we'll leave this here with an error message. So to start, let's just try creating a user. I'm going to use the same email address I did before just so we can see an error message, and we'll hit sign up. There's our error. The email address is already in use by another account. All right, let's do a new email address. I'll do my BYU email address. And let's give that a try. Cool. Create user successful. All right, so now we have our sign in and our sign up or create user functions working. Now we just got to take care of navigation once we've done those two things. To this point, the way we've navigated or changed the URL was by using the link component. The problem with that is you can only use a link component if a user is clicking on something. And at this point in here, the user's not clicking. We're just running a function. There's no user action. So we're going to need a different way of changing the URL. Fortunately, React Router has a function built in. Flipping over here to index.js, when a route runs and renders a component, it actually passes a bunch of properties to that component automatically. You can't see that happening here, but trust me, it's happening behind the scenes. To show you that, what I'm going to do is inside of this sign in component, I'm just going to log out what props looks like. And let's go back over here to the sign in page. All right, there you go. So it's getting logged what our props looks like. If we open this up, you're going to see four, but really 3 objects inside of here: match, location, and history. Flipping back over here, notice that we didn't pass any properties to these components. Where are they coming from? Well, like I just said, route creates a bunch of properties that it automatically passes down to the components. One called match, one called location, and one called history. Each of these objects are useful for different things, but the one we're going to use is history. History has a bunch of functions inside of it. Each of these functions are useful for changing the URL. The function we're interested in is called push. What push will do is change the URL to whatever URL we pass to the function. All right, so if we go back over here to app.js, what I want to do now is I want to access this push function. So what we logged out was props, so we know it's inside of props.history.push. Okay, so right in here, what I want to do is I want to say props.history.push, and then I want to put the URL that I want it to send me to. And that URL is /app. Cool. So I can now do the same thing inside of our create user function, props.history.push with /app inside of it. All right, let's give this a try. So I'm on the sign-in page. I'm going to type chris.crittenden@gmail.com, testing, and click sign in. And sure enough, I was successful and it took me to the signed in app page. All right, before I forget, I'm going to delete this console.log statement so I don't keep cluttering up my console. I'll close the console down. Let's do a couple of cleanup things before we move on. First off, let's get that password to be hidden when we type it in. So the way you do that is on the text field down here, they have a property called type. And all you have to do is pass type of password. And now when we type over here, sure enough, it's hiding my password. All right, so I want to do that in two places. I want to do that on the sign in component. I also want to do it down here on the sign up component. All right, the last bit of cleanup we want to do is, rather than just logging out the error message, let's send an alert message. This probably isn't the best. What I would really like to do is display a little message right here, which isn't too hard to do, but I'll leave that for your own exercise. So inside of the alert, we're going to say error.message. We'll delete our log statement, and we will do the same thing down here. Okay, so now if you try to create a user that's invalid for some reason or sign in with incorrect credentials, you'll get a pop-up message in your browser. All right, the next thing we want to do is take care of sign out. So let's come down here to the app component, and actually I'm going to just copy one of those functions again because they're pretty handy. Handle sign up. I'm going to paste it down here inside of app. Let's call this thing now handle sign out. The function we need to call is just called sign out. We don't have to pass anything to it. Inside of our then, rather than taking us to app, we just want to take you to / once you've signed out. I'll delete that. Just realized I didn't delete my console.log statement up here either. I can actually probably delete all of these comments as well. Okay, and then down here in our sign out, I don't know why we would get an error trying to sign out, but I guess it's possible, so we'll leave that alert there for now. And now we just need to run this function when someone clicks on that button. So let's go down here. We're going to get rid of the to in the component stuff. And instead we're going to add an onClick equals curly brace and run that function we just wrote. Handle sign out. Cool, let's give it a try. I'll come over here, I'm going to try signing in. That took me to the app. No, I don't want to save my password. Now if I click sign out, hopefully it signs me out and takes me back to the sign in page. There we go. All right, at this point, our authentication app is almost complete. We have just one more feature to build, and unfortunately, it also happens to be the most complicated. I'll do my best to explain it as clearly as possible, but you may want to watch this video a couple of times through so you can really understand what's going on here. Right now, you can navigate to the signed in view even if you haven't signed in. I can just change the URL and it will take me there. So let's do that. Here I am on the sign in page. I just signed out, so I'm not signed in anymore. I'm going to navigate to /app, and sure enough, it takes me to the signed in view, even though I'm not signed in. We don't want our app to behave this way. If I'm not signed in, we want the app to redirect us back to the sign in page. Similarly, if I end up on the sign in page and I'm already signed in, I want the app to automatically take me to the signed in view. What you haven't been able to see from the code we've written so far is that Firebase is keeping track of my authentication state in the background. So if we could just get access to that state when our app loads, we could send the user to the right place. Fortunately, there is a Firebase function for just that purpose. It's called onAuthStateChanged. When you run this function, it will set up what's called a listener. A listener essentially runs in the background, and it will listen for any changes in authentication state, including an initial check for the current state. We want to run this function as soon as any of our components come onto the screen. Since it runs a listener in the background, we also need to make sure to cancel that listener when the component leaves the screen. Otherwise, we could end up with a bunch of these listeners all running at the same time as we navigate back and forth between the various components. React provides a way for us to achieve this behavior of running a function when a component comes on the screen and canceling that function when the component goes off the screen. It's done with a function called useEffect. Let me write out some code and then I'll explain what it does. First, up here at the top, I'm going to import useEffect. Then, inside of my sign-in component, I'm going to write out useEffect parentheses to run my useEffect function. UseEffect accepts two parameters. The first parameter is the function that I want it to run when the component loads on the screen. So I'm just going to write out an anonymous function. Parentheses, arrow, curly brace. Okay, so now when the sign in component comes on the screen, it's going to run this anonymous function that does nothing. What we want our anonymous function to run is onAuthStateChanged from Firebase. So the way we do that is we say auth.onAuthStateChanged, open parentheses, close parentheses. So that's going to set up a listener for authentication state changes. But now I need to tell Firebase what to do when the state actually changes. To do that, I'm going to pass another function to onAuthStateChanged. So again, I'll write out an anonymous function with parentheses, arrow, curly brace, and then inside of here, I want to do something when my authentication state changes. Anytime the authentication state changes, Firebase is going to pass the user object, assuming there is one, into our function. So our function needs to accept a parameter. I'm going to just call that parameter u, since it's passing in a user object. If the user signs out, this function is going to detect that and pass null into our function as u. And similarly, if the user signs in, this function is going to detect that and pass the new user object into our function. The user object is basically an object that contains everything we know about the user, which in our simple app is just the email address. Inside of our function, if u is null, meaning there is no user signed in, then I want to stay right here on the sign-in page. But if there is a user object, so if it's not null, then what I want to do is redirect the user to /app. So I'm going to set up an if statement like this. So if u, so that's basically saying if it exists, then what I want to do is navigate to /app. We've done this before, so I'm going to say props.history.push quotes /app. Okay, let's take a step back and review what's going on here. As soon as our component loads, useEffect is going to run. We're running a function here, useEffect parentheses. It will run the function that we passed to it, this guy here. This function, in turn, will run our onAuthStateChanged function, which sets up a listener that watches for changes to the authentication state. Anytime that authentication state changes, the listener will pass the new user object into our function, if there is one. And if there is a user object, it's going to say, hey, you're in the wrong place, and push us over to /app. Okay, great. Now we need to provide useEffect with a way of turning our listener off when the component leaves the screen. UseEffect is built in such a way that this function here, our outer function, the one we're passing to useEffect, needs to return a function that can cancel our listener. Okay, so it needs to return and then something here that will cancel our listener. Okay? Fortunately for us, Firebase has built these functions to return a function that can cancel the listener. So if I write out a variable, I'm going to call it unsubscribe, and set it equal to the results of this function, unsubscribe will be a function that can cancel this listener. Confusing, I know. So now all we have to do is return unsubscribe, because unsubscribe is a function that will cancel this onAuthStateChanged listener. I warned you this was going to be confusing. Again, I'd recommend watching this video again and again until you really understand this concept. We're going to be using effects and Firebase functions a lot, and so it's important that you understand how this part works. Okay, we need to make one more change to useEffect to get the behavior we want. By default, useEffect will run our function whenever the component loads, and then again, anytime one of our state or props changes. That could result in many listeners being set up and could even result in an infinite loop. To prevent that, we need to pass it a second parameter. The second parameter needs to be an array of the variables that we're using inside of our function. In our case, that's just this one here, props.history. We're not using any other state or props variables. So after the curly brace, noting the end of my function, I'm going to put a comma and pass a second parameter, which is an array. Inside of that array, I'm going to put props.history. What this will do is now useEffect will run once when the component loads, and then it will only run again if props.history changes, which in our case is going to be never. Theoretically, you could actually just pass an empty array. Then it would just run once when the component loads. That's considered bad practice though, and so it's best to always put any variables that you are using inside of your function inside of the array. And that's because if by chance props.history did change, then you actually would want to run this function again. Otherwise, props.history would do the wrong thing. Okay, so to recap just a little. In addition to passing useEffect a function that sets up our listener and that returns a way of canceling that listener, we also need to pass it an array that contains any of the variables that we're using. That will prevent useEffect from rerunning every single time any state variable or props variable changes, and instead just allow it to run once when the component loads, and again anytime this variable changes. Awesome. So now that we have this set up inside of our sign-in component, we can simplify our code just slightly. Since our listener here is going to detect any changes in authentication state and automatically redirect to /app, we no longer need to include this redirect inside of handle sign-in. Since as soon as we sign in, onAuthStateChanged is going to detect that, recognize our user object, and redirect us to the right place. So let's just delete both of these lines. All right, let's test to make sure this works. I'm going to sign out. Now I'm going to sign in. And notice that even though I got rid of that change here, it detected the change in state and automatically pushed me into my signed in view. Now, just to demonstrate that this is really working, let's just manually navigate without signing out back to our root. If this is working, it should detect that I'm still signed in and automatically redirect me to my signed in view. Okay, so there you saw really briefly the sign in screen flashed. It recognized we were still signed in and it redirected us to our app. Now we just need to add exactly the same logic to our sign up page. And again, I don't need this redirect since the onAuthStateChanged is going to take care of that. And let's paste this same thing down into our app view, although we're going to have to modify it just a little bit. Okay, so inside of our app, if there is a user object, we actually want to stay right here. We don't want to go anywhere. So I'm going to just delete that. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to add an else to our if statement. And inside of the else is where we'll say props.history.push, and we want to send them back to the sign-in page if there is no user object. All right, let's test and see if this works. All right, so I'm currently signed in, so it's leaving me on the app page. I'm going to click sign out, and now let me manually type the URL of /app. If this is working like it's supposed to, it should very briefly show us the signed in view and then redirect us back to the sign in page. There you go. It did just what we hoped. Okay, we're all but done here. To show you the last thing we need to do, I'm going to sign back in. And recall from the very beginning how we hard-coded chris.crittenden@gmail.com? What we really want to do is grab this email address from our authenticated state. Remember how I said over here that when onAuthStateChanged detects a change to our authentication state, it will pass a user object in? That user object contains the email address. So what we would like to do is grab that email address out of there and put it up here to display. To do that, I'm going to set up a state variable. Say const bracket. I'm going to call this variable user. And the way we'll change our user is with set user equal to useState, and our initial value for this user is just going to be null. So now, when onAuthStateChanged detects a change, rather than doing nothing here, if there is a user object, instead we want to say set user and set it equal to you. It'll take that user object and put it up in here in state. So now what we can do is we can access the email address inside of user. And where we want to do that is right down here. Instead of having a hard-coded chris.crittenden@gmail.com, we want to look up the value of the email address from our user state variable. Since we need to look something up, we need to run JavaScript. Anytime in JSX you want to run JavaScript, you need to do curly braces. So we'll just type some curly braces, and then we'll say user.email. Now as soon as we did that, you can see that we're getting this error message over here. Cannot read property email of null. That's happening because when our component loads, user is null. And it takes a minute for onAuthStateChanged to detect the authentication state, pass the object in, and use the setUser function to update it. In that time it's doing all of that, this code ran and threw an error. So what we need to do is we need to prevent this code from running until user is no longer null. The way we'll do that is right before our return, we're going to write an if statement. We'll say if not user. So if there is no user object, which would be null, then return, and we're just going to have it return an empty div, like this. So now, while it's null, it just returns an empty div. As soon as it's not null, it reruns this stuff, skips our if statement, and now returns our whole page. And voila, you can see it showing up over here. It's showing my email address of chris.crittenden@byu.edu. Just to show that this can change, I'm going to sign in with my personal email address. And there it is. It's now dynamic. Okay, and with that, we are done with the Authentication app. Congratulations.